This technical seminars are an Intertech production. For instructor-led .NET, Java, and XML courses, visit us at www.intertech.com.
Want to add a view? Well, we can go ahead and choose the actual folder within the views folder that we want to add a view to, and then go ahead and choose add view. Remember, make sure you're working in the subfolders within the particular view. Each of these subfolders are named after, of course, the different controllers. Views, of course, are their standard ASPX and ASCX web objects, but that's basically where the similarities with web forms ends. Because after at that point, then all of a sudden we're in charge of the actual HTML and JavaScript that's going to be sent to the client. And of course, views do make use of that less than percent and percent greater than syntax that we had in classic ASP. Very similar to the response.write, but it's actually shorter. Something else to keep in mind, creating simple controls that appear on the client side, well, we actually have some HTML helpers we do that with. For example, you'll notice if you want to create a very simple text box, we'll say, the less than percent equals html.textbox, and that of course will be the name of the text box, txt name. And we also have other HTML helpers for checkboxes, radio buttons, hidden form fields, password text boxes. And what's interesting about this is that all of these different HTML helpers are just there to create some very simplistic HTML and sending it off to the client. We don't see those rich controls that we had in classic ASP, or not classic ASP, but ASP.NET forms, like, hey, I want to add a calendar control, right? And those are other types of helpers that can be created, of course. You can always create your own custom helpers, but it's going to require more coding. And I suspect that as ASP.NET MVC matures, that there are going to be more richer HTML helpers for us in the future. The views, some people might think, are we back to spaghetti code like we had in classic ASP with VBScript? Not exactly. Views only controls went back to the browser, but there is no other pieces of logic. You'll notice that the actual routing logic was handled in the global.asax. We actually had the controller class exposing the public methods depending on what the request was on the query string. And then the views are just in charge of what's actually being displayed. They have no data access logic, if you will, or a business logic that might be in the actual models. Okay. Now models, easy part of all this MVC, because, well, really, you're in charge of exactly what's in the model. If you just want to reference a separate DLL that you have all your data access logic inside of, or maybe just some other classes that are compiled into your web application project, that's what the model is all about. And if you want to use the entity framework, go for it. If you want to use link to SQL, that's fine. If you have your own custom classes which are pulling data out of XML or calling web services, hey, that's your model. Keep in mind, MVC is not a hard set of rules, and if you find yourself being confined when you use MVC, you're basically failing the use of MVC. Then maybe you should reconsider a different architecture altogether. Models, of course, are just the way that we access the data and present it to the actual views and to their controllers. Now, of course, like I said, data can be in multiple locations when you use a model, whether you have the data stored in XML files or a relational database. Maybe you're using SQL or MySQL or whatever type of database you're using, or maybe just pure business logic. It represents the smarts and the intelligence of your system. In other words, the data that's going to be used and displayed by your application. Now, using the Object Relational Mapper in Visual Studio 2008, keep in mind it is changing a lot in Studio 2010, and so is the Entity Framework, as I mentioned before, so be aware of that when you take a look at Visual Studio 2008 and what it has for link to SQL and such. Test-driven development, of course, like I mentioned, it was downgraded to the professional level of Visual Studio 2008, and the class designer can help make your TDD methods by designing them to automatically fail by default. The class designer built into Visual Studio, that's where you go ahead and add methods to your classes and such. By default, they'll always throw an exception and it'll assume that they have not been implemented. And of course, true test-driven development developers, if you will, always write their tests first, and then they go right to code in their methods and properties to pass all those tests. Okay? And of course, good unit testing frameworks will always test all possible methods and properties no matter what their accessibility is, if it's public or private or internal or protected internal. Some things you may want to do for testing of your ASP.NET MVC applications. You're going to want to test your routes, right? Remember the register routes method that was in our global.asax? You want to test that guy to make sure that all the routes are working properly. You may also want to test your controllers to simulate multiple requests made by users. And you know what? Like that lower bullet point mentions, web users will try to pass you anything, and be ready for that. They will try to call any public method that's available off your controller class. You need to be able to test it, and you need to set them to the appropriate page if they make an ill-formed request. And of course, testing the models is also extremely important. You want to test the models depending on how you're accessing the data, or if you're using any special business rules. Okay. Finally, the views. Some developers do go as far as to test all their individual views as well, but the problem is with your views, if you change them just slightly, just changing one extra space that's emitted back to the client in HTML or in JavaScript, that's going to change your result, and then how do you test for that? So some developers prefer not to test their views exactly. Keep in mind, just mentioning it again, because there's a lot of information here, that you can have your own custom views if you'd like. There are other view engines out there that you could use portion of the ASP.NET MVC framework with your own view engine. Just Google that and find some different tools that you can use. Just wrapping up here, my thoughts on ASP.NET MVC. You are going to get some useful error messages when you're working with the framework, but you are going to have some patience as well getting it to work correctly, especially when you're in the view section. I found my biggest struggle was working directly inside of views, specifically how do I get the data back out of the dictionary objects, whether it be for the view data or for the test data. How do I get that information out and format it into properly formed HTML? How do I work with JavaScript? How do I get that exactly out? And of course, the best way to do this is to look at existing examples that are out there, such as that website, ASP.NET/MVC. Take a look at some coding examples out there. Documentation, books. There are MVC books out there right now. Don't be afraid of picking up the Rocks book, Beginning MVC. I really like that book because that explains why they did certain things in MVC. Some developers say, well, I don't buy beginning books. Well, hey, it's sometimes helpful just to see the basic facts when you're learning a brand new topic such as this. I found that Beginning MVC book to be valuable because it explains some of the simple questions that I had about MVC. I've got the more advanced books as well, and they're excellent for using as a reference. But sometimes it helps with just taking a look at a beginner book. There's only maybe you don't want to have a beginner book on your shelf at work. We'll leave that one at home then. Anyways, the MVC framework is wide open. You can go ahead and customize as you want because all the source code is publicly available, right? Do you want to go this MVC route? You need to make that decision yourself, or maybe your team needs to make that decision. Obviously, it is going to require more coding. It is not something that simplifies or gives you less coding. It actually requires more coding to create web applications. And you're entirely in charge of what HTML and JavaScript is sent back to the client, to the web browser. And some developers are going to love it. Others are going to think, hey, it was a lot easier in ASP.NET Forms. I'll just stick to that. That's fine. This is just an alternative, if you will.
For more free learning resources and to see the latest lineup of our instructor-led .NET, Java, and XML courses, visit us at www.intertech.com.